Hi, my name's Hugh Lufton. I'm principal of Lufton Associates. Today I'm just doing a very quick overview of a matter that's very critical to planning and development at the moment, which is flood risk, and how flood risk is handled in the planning system through flood risk assessment. In England, the responsibility of assessing, monitoring and regulating flood risk is divided between the Environment Agency, the lead flood authority and local authorities. So in broad terms, the Environment Agency has a strategic overview and looks at strategic flood risk, significant flood risks sort of over a wide area. The lead flood authority, which in Staffordshire's case is Staffordshire County Council, have an overview of sites and gives standing advice and comment and make representations on planning applications. And local authorities are involved in various ways, but they of course are the jurisdiction over planning applications. So they would consult the lead flood authority, Staffordshire County Council, and where necessary the Environment Agency over flood risk. So there's different types of flooding. Obviously there's flooding, a risk from rivers and seas. There's flood risk, tidal flood risk. Thankfully we're not exposed to tidal flood risk in Staffordshire, but our risk comes from major rivers, or can come from major rivers and tributaries of those rivers in times of excess rainfall. There's also surface water flooding, which is important. That's obviously where sites retain water and it doesn't drain away and can cause a flood risk to homes and businesses, etc. There's also flooding when, and maybe sometimes critical, when existing drainage systems are overwhelmed, and particularly when sewerage systems are overwhelmed, because that creates a risk to human health, generally more unpleasant. The country is divided into flood zones, flood zone 1, 2 and 3. And 3 is divided into 3A and 3B. Now, quite onerous in terms of submitting planning applications and looking at development. All sites, all planning applications over 1 hectare are required in flood zone 1, so the lowest level of flood risk in the country, are required to submit a flood risk assessment as part of the consideration of the planning application. Flood zone 1 is defined as having a risk of flooding between 1 in 1,000, in less than 1,000, 1 in 1,000 years, so a risk of it flooding once in a 1,000 year period. Flood zone 2 has a risk between 1 in 100 and 1 in 1,000, so 1 year risk in between 100 and 1,000 years, and flood zone 3 is a greater risk than that. Just as an indication, in England 5.2 million homes and businesses lie in flood zones 2 and 3. They are quite extensive. There's large parts of Burton upon Trent, on the River Trent, significant parts of the centre of Burton on Trent that are in flood zones 2 and 3. Significant parts of the town centre of Burton are in flood zones 2 and 3. So it's not to say that already that development lies outside flood zones. It clearly doesn't. There's a lot of development in flood zones. There's quite a lot of development in Staffordshire villages that lies in flood zones that are on tributaries of watercourses and so on. There is a planning policy approach that development proposed in flood zones 2 and 3 and and this gets more onerous the greater the risk of flooding, should follow a sequential approach. So the idea is that you obviously look outside the flood zone for development first. So if you were leading through a local plan, you wouldn't expect significant development sites to be allocated in the floodplain of a river at the centre of a town. That's fairly sensible. The sequential test approach means that the onus is on the developer, on the developer's agent and their technical consultants to demonstrate that their development is required in a site that is at risk of flooding, and there's a sequential approach to why that is the case. So it may be, for example, that development is very restricted in a certain area, and it's simply not possible to build outside of the flood zone. It may be there are a host of other considerations why it is appropriate to build in the flood zone, because of various other planning constraints or planning and technical and development engineering constraints, etc. After the sequential test, there's also an exceptions test for zones 2 and 3, and that is where you have to demonstrate there are a whole range of valid reasons why you would develop it in the flood zone. The overall balance is in favour of the development, so the overall benefits against the overall difficulties and negativities, negative externalities of the development are overcome. One of the things that I think is really significant challenge for planning and significant challenge for how we go forward with the development of our country and development of our towns and our villages is some of the most sustainable sites. In other terms, the most favourable sites for development are in flood zones. So major town centre development is often in the flood zone. There are some highly suitable housing sites that are good in all other terms other than the fact that they're in flood zones 2 and 3. And this obviously creates difficulty because in a balanced overview of planning and sustainability and looking at things like climate change, you wouldn't want to rule out everything else and flooding to be the only consideration. And that's because, of course, you can mitigate flooding. There are ways of building, there are ways of designing schemes, drainage schemes, that can mitigate flooding, and there are ways of building development, certainly in flood zone 2, that can make a positive contribution to the risk of flooding generally and preventing flooding elsewhere. We have almost a retained drainage engineer now to look at flood risk. We have access to various flood risk engineers, and we have them at different scales, at different levels of importance when it comes to looking at flood risk assessment. So what I would say is flood risk causes a problem for planning applications. It's an extra constraint, it's a significant constraint, it's one of the first things that we would look at considering the approach to any application. But it is not insurmountable when proposing development in a flood zone. It is just an additional, fairly onerous technical consideration. It certainly isn't something that should be seen to be the only consideration, the sort of the showstopper that prevents what is otherwise sustainable development. Okay, that's all I've got for now. Thanks. Bye.